everyone, Ivy here, also known as the Solo Artist. Today I'm going to be discussing the construction process for the beaded panel on the House of Worth Sunburst Dress. This is going to end up being a multi-part series because this project is easily the most complicated thing that I have ever personally undertaken. A bit of a magnum opus, if you will. So today the only thing that I'm really going to be talking about is just the beading on the front. Before we get into it, a little intro on the project and why I chose this in particular. This dress has been in my imagination for years at this point, but in 2024 it was featured in the Met Gala as part of their Sleeping Beauties exhibit. What's really tragic about this particular dress is that it was made in a way that makes preservation almost impossible. Around the turn of the century, it wasn't uncommon for silk to be treated with a bath of metal salts, which has a few different effects on the textile. Silk was often sold by weight, so the metal salts increase the weight of the silk. It also makes it easier to dye the fabric. It was more color fast that way, and it just has a more luxurious feel. The downside is that the metal salts degrade the silk, and over time, fairly quickly actually, it causes catastrophic, irreversible damage. These silks that have been treated with the metal salts are going to degrade essentially no matter how you attempt to preserve them. There are ways to slow down the process, but there's no way to reverse it or stop it completely. So there's just this incredible couture gown sitting in a museum, and its time is limited. Someday it just will not exist anymore. Because the garment is so delicate, it couldn't even be displayed on a mannequin for the exhibit. It had to be displayed flat in a glass case because displaying it on the mannequin would only have done more damage to the silk and sped up the degradation process. I think something that is so incredible and magical about historical clothing is that it makes history feel alive. It's so much easier to picture what the past might have looked like when you can see people inhabiting something from the past, like fashion. So I thought it was kind of a shame that this dress had to just be put in this case and could never be worn again. So I decided that what I wanted to do was a recreation, kind of as a way to keep it alive. So when I was standing in my local fabric store and I saw this incredible Duchess silk satin for a really good price, it was like my life flashed before my eyes. I could see everything about this garment, how it would be constructed, what it would look like, how it would feel, every stitch and every bead. I knew exactly where they would go. So let's get into it. I actually got kind of lucky because of the way that the garment was displayed. It was laid perfectly flat so that it was very easy to enlarge the design without having to worry about any warping that could have been caused by ripples in the fabric. I used a projector to enlarge the design. I am not an expert on this kind of thing, so I wish I could tell you how I figured out the scale, but the truth is that I kind of just eyeballed it. I ended up sketching it out 2 or 3 times before I got the scale right. There's probably a correct fancy math way to enlarge to the design so that you don't have to just keep trying and failing and redoing it, but figuring out how to do it the right way would probably have taken me longer than just winging it. Once I had the design on a big sheet of paper, I cleaned it up a little bit and finalized the design using a fine tip Sharpie. This makes it a little bit easier to transfer the design to the silk because it's easier to see that bolder outline underneath the silk. Before I could transfer the design to the silk, I had to cut and stitch the front and side panels because I knew that the design would continue over those seams and I wanted it to look completely seamless. So to transfer the design, I put weights on top of the fabric to help prevent any shifting, and then I used a light tracing board thing to backlight the design and a heat friction pen to transfer it to the silk. I actually do not recommend using a heat pen on silk satin because the pen unfortunately does leave a mark even after it's been ironed. I couldn't think of a better way to mark the fabric, and I also knew that the entirety of the pen marks would be covered by the beads and the braid work. So I was just really careful and knew that I had to get it right the first time because I couldn't erase anything, and luckily that did end up working out for me. The next step is to go over the line work that I just transferred with the braid. I originally thought that I was going to just use a plain pearly cotton thread for this step, but I started putting it on there and it just looked so dull to me and it was not serving what I wanted it to be serving. So I switched to a copper colored braid. You do need some special equipment for this part. I have a presser foot that keeps the braid in place. It's a presser foot with a little hole in the center that holds the braid in place, and then you follow the design on your sewing machine. Because this braid is super narrow, I used a tight zigzag to make sure that it was secure. I actually have a whole video on how to do this type of braid work, but that's more or less the gist of it. I swear, I'm making this sound so much faster and easier than it actually was. There's definitely some finesse to getting the braid work right so that it's applied evenly and smoothly and it doesn't look like weird or lumpy. It definitely takes some practice for sure, and however long you think it's gonna take, triple it. I really cannot stress how much longer this took than it sounds like. A few dozen hours just to do the braid work. I felt like I was chained to my sewing machine and I could not wait to get away from it. I was so sick of it by the end. But finally, once it was done, I was able to move on to the fun part. So initially, I thought I was going to be able to use a technique called timbre to attach the beads. This is essentially like a distant cousin of crochet. So the pieces worked from the front and the back at the same time, and you have this little like needle hook, and it pulls the thread with the beads on it up through to the back of the project. So it's a chain stitch but with beads on the thread. Timbre is really more meant to be used on sheer fabric so that you can see what you're doing. I thought that if I just put a really bright light behind the satin that I'd be able to see well enough to manipulate the thread on the bottom. This was not the case. I got through a couple of the clouds before I was like, this looks like garbage. I could not live with it. I just did not think that it looked clean enough for the project. And if I'm going to be spending like hundreds of hours on this garment, I want to do it right. I want to do it really well. So I scrapped that whole timbre idea. It was just not going to be the answer. I ended up just going with a simple backstitch. This is a very, very easy, very basic way to apply beads to a piece of fabric. Takes probably 4 or 5 times as long as timbre, because that's the whole like big advantage of timbre technique. It's a lot faster than just sewing the beads on in the traditional way. You anchor your thread just like you would for any sewing project, string like 6 or 7 beads onto the needle, and then you make a stitch the same length as the beads. Do a back stitch about half the length of the first stitch, and then thread your needle through the back to the end of the stitch and then repeat. Honestly, it's really simple. It's just very time consuming. So yeah, that's it. I just sat there and spent over 100 hours sewing beads to this garment. We have to keep in mind that there is thousands, if not tens of thousands of beads on this thing, so it did take a very long time. What's so interesting about this project is that none of the techniques that I used on it are especially difficult or complicated. I think that anyone could attach braid work, anyone could sew on beads. What's actually difficult about the project is the amount of time and commitment that it takes to execute it. I know a lot of people would not be able to sit there and spend like 300 or 400 hours on a single project, but I love this. I love it. I am so passionate about being able to do this that I'm willing to literally just sit there 300 or 400 hours. I'm looking forward to spending 300 or 400 hours on a single project. So I am almost done with the beaded panel. There's a little bit left, but I am almost ready to move on to the construction phase, which is super exciting. Watching this come together has been a really gratifying experience. I know that the work that I do is like good, but being able to see how far I've come from when I started costuming like 7 years ago to where I am now, I have put so much into this. I have put so much love and blood and sweat and tears and passion, and seeing it just fall into place is incredible. And I cannot wait for the next step of this garment. I am ready to start hemming dozens of yards of ruffles. That's it for this portion of the project. Please subscribe so that you can follow along with the rest of the steps on the project, and you can see the final dress when it's done. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.